When I first stepped onto that patch of mountain earth, I remember feeling something loosen inside my chest, like the land itself had reached up and pulled the weight off me for a moment, and I stood there listening to the wind sift through the pines, and it felt like a place where the noise of the world couldn't follow. I had spent more years than I care to count waking up inside alarms, the kind that split your sleep in half and drag you into chaos before your mind catches up, the kind where you learn to breathe through smoke before you learn to breathe through silence. 32 years inside burning rooms, 32 years carrying other people's fear, like a second set of gear. 32 years watching faces disappear into orange light and reappear, coughing, stumbling, thankful or not at all. And you don't realize what that does to you until the day you're no longer wearing a radio on your shoulder. When my wife left this world, the quiet that followed her wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that presses into your ribs and waits for you to break. And when the kids grew up and built lives elsewhere, I decided maybe it was time I learned what quiet was supposed to feel like, not the hollow kind, but the kind that still has breath in it. The cabin didn't look like much from the listing, an old structure tucked into the Blue Ridge with wood that had seen seasons come and go without complaint, 2 bedrooms, a fireplace stone that still held someone else's memories, tiny kitchen, sunlight pooling in the windows like it belonged there. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt something settle in my spine, and I knew I could rebuild myself in a place like this, slowly, patiently, without anyone asking me to be strong for them. The deck wrapped around the cabin like an arm, and every direction I turned, I saw mountains layered on mountains fading into blue, the way distant thoughts fade when you stop trying to hold them too tightly. I spent my first nights there, sleeping under blankets that still smelled faintly of pine and old wood, listening to the quiet, figuring out how to let it in, after years of blocking out everything that wasn't sirens or orders or panic. I fixed cabinets that didn't need fixing, oiled hinges that didn't need oiling, sanded the porch railings just to feel the wood under my hands. I learned the trails around the property, walked until my legs burned, breathed air that tasted like nothing I'd ever breathed in the city. And sometimes when the sun dipped low and the light went soft against the mountains, I felt something, like peace pressing close enough to touch. People think solitude makes you lonely, but it's the opposite. It's the first time you hear yourself, without everyone else's noise layered on top. I'd sit near the fireplace at night reading books I'd been collecting for years, telling myself I'd get to them eventually, and there, in that cabin, eventually finally meant something. My sister called not long after I settled in, and I remember thinking it was nice to hear another voice, until she started speaking in that tone she always used, when her words were carrying something sharp inside them, wrapped in sweetness. She talked about her kid, the one who drifted from idea to idea, as if life were a string of unopened doors, and he only needed to push the right one to become someone he kept trying to tell the world he already was. She said he was searching for direction, said he needed a project, something meaningful, something grounded, and I remember glancing out at the trees, thinking nothing about this place was built for someone else's ambitions, not anymore. I told her politely that the cabin was my home, not a workspace, not a rental, not a blank canvas, waiting for someone to turn it into a tagline or a pitch deck. She pushed in that way. Family sometimes does, leaning on memories, leaning on guilt, leaning on the idea that shared blood means shared decisions. And I felt that old ache rise up, the one that comes when people think your boundaries are optional. When I hung up, I thought that would be the end of it. Thought the mountain would protect me from whatever storm she was trying to send my way. But I've learned over time that storms don't need permission to climb a mountain. They always find a way. And that call was the first shift in the air, the faint change in pressure you only notice if you've spent a lifetime reading danger before it arrives. I didn't know yet that someone I loved was already planning to turn my sanctuary into their opportunity. I didn't know yet that peace is something people will try to take from you when they think they deserve it more. I only knew the mountains were quiet that night, and I thought the quiet meant I was safe. I was wrong. I should have felt the shift sooner, the way you feel a draft slip under a door before the storm rattles the whole frame. But I was too wrapped in the quiet, too convinced that distance could protect me from the same patterns that had chased my family for years, and maybe that's why the call from my sister didn't hit me the way it should have. She talked about her kid like he was some fragile miracle that needed only the right environment to bloom, and I heard myself giving polite answers while every part of me whispered that something wasn't lining up. It wasn't until the day I came back from town and saw that sleek car sitting in my gravel driveway like it belonged there that the truth started pressing against my ribs. He was on my deck, posing with the mountains behind him. Phone lifted like he owned the view, and the way he turned toward me with that bright smile made something cold settle under my sternum before a word was even spoken. I asked him what he was doing, and he talked like we'd already agreed to something, like the cabin was no longer a choice I had, but a resource he'd already counted on. He kept saying things like vision and market gap and revenue stream, while scrolling through pages of charts he barely understood, and I stood there feeling the walls of my own home shift like they were being pulled away from me, inch by inch. He said he only needed a foot in the door, but the way he said it told me he intended to push the whole door down. The part that stuck under my skin wasn't the pitch itself, but the certainty in his voice, the assumption that my quiet life existed simply to stabilize his next reinvention. I told him no clearer than I've told anyone anything, and he nodded politely, the way people nod when they've already decided your answer is irrelevant. When he left, I thought the mountain would swallow the whole encounter in silence, but the air felt tighter, somehow like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to snap. 3 days later, my phone started ringing with numbers I didn't know, and each voice asked about bookings, availability, group sizes, as if my cabin had suddenly become a product. I asked where they got my number, and every single caller said the same thing: they found my listing. I opened my laptop, and my lungs stopped working. My home was there, laid out like a commodity, photos taken without my consent, angles he stole from wandering around my deck, words that painted this place as some curated sanctuary for people chasing productivity and self-discovery. He had a calendar taking reservations. He had pricing. He had an entire brand built out, as if this land had been waiting for him to assign meaning to it. Something in me splintered, quiet but sharp. I called him, and he didn't pick up. Then his mother called, trying to soften it all, with her voice dripping disappointment, as if I were the one tearing the family apart by refusing to let someone profit off my life. I hung up on her. I hired a lawyer. The next day the kid stepped onto my porch again, but this time the smile was gone, and what replaced it was something uglier: entitlement without the mask. He said I was being emotional, that I wasn't thinking clearly, that this was free money falling from the sky, and only a fool would step out of the way. I told him again no, and he kept treating the word like a suggestion. The part that made my hands shake wasn't the arrogance, it was the absolute belief he had that my home existed to solve his problems. He said he'd already taken deposits, and when I told him to return them, he said he couldn't because he'd spent the money. I remember the fury rising in me slowly, like heat in a closed room. No siren, no alarm, just that steady climb. You don't notice until you realize your heartbeat has changed. I gave him one last chance to walk away, to untangle himself from what he'd started. But he stood there acting like I owed him something, and I saw something in his eyes I'd seen in so many others over the years, the kind of hunger that doesn't stop until it devours everything in reach. When he finally left, the mountain didn't feel quiet anymore. It felt watched. It felt like my peace had been marked by someone who believed he could carve into it. And as the door closed behind him, the cabin didn't feel like refuge. It felt like a line I suddenly understood I would have to defend. The morning after that confrontation, I woke up with the kind of tightness in my chest I used to get before walking into a burning building. That prickling sense that something had already gone wrong, somewhere I couldn't see yet, and the silence around the cabin felt too still, almost like the woods were waiting for me to catch up to the danger already crawling through the edges of my life. I made coffee with hands that wouldn't stop tapping against the counter, and I kept checking my phone, expecting another call from someone, thinking they had booked to stay here, expecting the mess to spill even further. And sure enough, before the mug even cooled, the phone lit up again. More voices asking about dates and availability, like my home had been open for business for years. I opened the website again and saw new pictures, added angles I never took, moments he must have stolen while walking through my rooms without my permission, and something inside me twisted hard, because that wasn't carelessness, that was intrusion, deliberate, calculated intrusion. It wasn't just that he ignored my boundaries, it was that he erased them, acted like they'd never existed to begin with. And I realized then that this wasn't a temporary scheme or a passing obsession. He had already decided this place belonged to him in some imaginary future he had built out of entitlement and desperation. The lawyer told me to keep every screenshot, every message, every call log, and I did, but gathering evidence didn't stop the feeling of violation swelling in my throat, the sense that parts of my private world had been turned into props, his ambition without my consent. When I saw the second website, a full listing selling my property, as if he had the right to hand over my life to the highest bidder, something in me snapped with a clarity so sharp I had to sit down just to breathe. He had created an entire narrative where I was a retiring old man looking to offload a cabin I was supposedly finished with, and reading those words made my skin crawl, not because they were wrong, but because he wrote them with confidence, as if he had the authority to decide the direction of my life. I didn't want to involve law enforcement yet, but the lawyer insisted we might need them, and for the first time since moving here, I felt fear, not the kind I'd felt in burning houses, but a quieter kind, the kind that grows when you realize someone close to you believes your existence is negotiable. Calls from family started coming in, people I hadn't spoken to in months, suddenly asking why I couldn't just help the kid, why I had to be so rigid, why a cabin mattered more than blood, and each question hit me like a shove toward a line they wanted me to cross. No one asked how I felt about strangers staying in my home, about someone stealing my photos, my peace, my privacy. They asked why I couldn't cooperate, why I couldn't sacrifice just a little. It was astonishing how quickly people can make you the villain when you refuse to let yourself be stepped on. The real fracture happened when I returned from town one afternoon and saw unfamiliar footprints in the mud by the steps, but no car in sight. And for a second, my whole body froze, because I knew those prints weren't mine, and they weren't. From the kid, either too large, too heavy, too intentional. Someone had come close enough to the cabin to look around, maybe to check access, maybe to see if the place matched the listing he'd created, and the idea of unknown eyes scanning the property had my pulse pounding so hard I could hear it. I walked through my house searching for signs, anything moved out of place, anything touched, and though nothing was stolen, the disturbance itself was enough to rattle me. I realized then that he had opened my door to people who didn't care about me, who believed they had purchased a piece of my space, and that was the moment fear turned into resolve, like a flame finding oxygen. I called the lawyer again, this time with a tone that surprised even me, and told him we were done, asking nicely, done, hoping he would listen, done, giving him space to correct himself. If he wanted to behave like a stranger trying to claim something that wasn't his, then I would treat him like one. For years I'd been the one pulling people from danger. Now danger was standing on my deck, smiling through a website full of lies, and I knew what needed to happen next. The line he crossed wasn't just about property, it was about dignity, and the moment someone tries to take that from you, there is no going back. I knew the fight was coming, and for the first time in a long time I didn't back away from it. I braced for it. The morning the lawyer sent the first official letter, I thought maybe the threat alone would be enough to make him back off, but by the time the sun set I realized he had never planned to back off at all, because entitlement doesn't retreat, it doubles down. I spent the day trying to distract myself, sanding the rail on the deck, patching a loose board, sweeping pine needles from the steps. But every few minutes I kept checking my phone, half expecting more strangers to call asking about bookings, and sure enough the calls kept coming like a slow drip of intrusion that wouldn't stop. Each ring chipped away at something inside me, until all that was left was a tight coil of anger waiting to snap. The lawyer said the hearing might take weeks, but we would likely win the injunction because the evidence was overwhelming. Yet that brought no comfort, because winning in court didn't erase the fact that my home had become a stage for people I didn't know, people imagining themselves sitting in my chairs, sleeping in my bed, walking my floors, while believing they had bought the right to be there. My sister called again, pretending she was just checking in, but her voice had that tilt to it, the same tone that tries to turn guilt into leverage. And she started talking about sacrifice, about helping the next generation, about opportunities, not coming twice. And I felt something in my stomach twist, because she wasn't hearing a word. I said she was listening only for a version of me that didn't exist anymore, the one who let family take whatever they wanted, because it was easier that way. After I hung up, I walked outside to breathe, but the air didn't settle anything inside me. It only made the mountain feel smaller, like the space between me and the world wasn't as wide as I thought. Then came the second discovery, the listing, pretending my cabin was for sale, and when I saw the price attached to it, as if someone could measure the worth of my life in dollars, I felt a kind of heat rise in my chest, so intense my hands shook. He wasn't just borrowing my property for a business dream, he was claiming ownership in the eyes of strangers, painting a picture of me as a man ready to leave behind the quiet I had fought decades to earn, and that lie enraged me more than anything else. The lawyer told me to save everything, so I screenshotted every page, every photo, every line of text until it felt like I was documenting a crime scene in slow motion. That night I couldn't sleep, kept hearing pine branches brush against the cabin like footsteps, kept imagining headlights turning into the driveway, people with suitcases expecting a retreat, ready to demand access because they had paid. Just before dawn I finally drifted off, only to wake to another message, this time from a real estate agent, asking if I wanted to discuss selling, and something inside me snapped so sharply I could feel my pulse hammering behind my eyes. I told the lawyer I wanted everything filed immediately, every petition, every protective order, anything that would shut this down fast, and he agreed, saying we had more than enough to take it to a judge. But the worst part came 2 days later, when I returned from picking up supplies in town and saw a car parked awkwardly beside the driveway. Not a sleek car, not a tourist car, but a beat-up one with people standing on my deck looking around, as if assessing property they believed they had access to. They were frustrated, angry, confused, saying they had booked the place for a week and that I was causing problems by not being ready for them. And then he appeared walking toward them with that same confident stride, acting like he was the mediator, like I was the obstacle, like this whole disaster was my fault. He spoke to the group with practiced ease, telling them I was just having a moment, telling them everything would be sorted out, telling them not to worry because the place was theirs for the week. And when he said that, a cold numbness washed over me because he wasn't just lying, he was rewriting my reality right in front of me. The deputies arrived quickly after a neighbor called about the commotion, and the look on the officer's face when he realized these people had paid for access to a property the kid didn't own was equal parts disbelief and irritation. Watching those strangers pack their bags with angry muttering felt surreal, like I was standing outside my own life, or like a bad dream that refused to end. The deputy turned to me asking if I wanted to press charges, and for a moment I just stared at him because the idea of involving law enforcement against someone connected to me felt heavy, even though everything inside me screamed it was deserved. The kid left angry, claiming misunderstanding, claiming family drama, claiming anything except responsibility. And as he drove away, the air around the cabin felt thin, like a part of my refuge had been torn open. When the deputies left, I sat on the deck staring at the mountains that had always felt like protection but now felt like silent witnesses, and I realized something sharp and unshakable. This wasn't going to stop on its own. He had crossed every boundary I had. If I didn't fight with everything I had left, I would lose the only place where I could still breathe, and I wasn't about to let anyone take that from me. When the court date finally came, I expected to feel anger boiling in my chest, but what surprised me most was the stillness inside me, a kind of quiet resolve that felt heavier than rage, but steadier too, like a weight I could finally carry, without slipping. I sat in that small beige courtroom listening to the shuffle of papers and the clicking of pens, while he sat on the other side pretending confidence. But I could see the twitch in his jaw, the way his hands wouldn't settle, the way his eyes darted toward the door every few seconds, as if hoping someone would burst in and rescue him from the reality he had stepped into. My sister sat behind him, arms crossed, face tight, staring at me like I was betraying the entire family simply by refusing to be walked over. But I kept my gaze forward because if I looked at her too long I would start remembering all the years I spent biting my tongue for the sake of peace, and I wasn't that man anymore. When the judge read through the evidence, there was a shift in the room, a slow gathering of consequence, wrapping around him like invisible rope, tightening each time. She listed another action he thought he could talk his way out of. The fraudulent listings, the bookings taken under false pretenses, the attempted sale of a property that never belonged to him, the invasion of my home, the trespassing incident, the manipulation of strangers, and above all, the assumption that family ties gave him permission to take whatever he wanted. I watched his confidence drain from him in tiny increments, his shoulders slowly curling inward, his breathing turning shallow, his eyes darting toward his lawyer, who looked like he wanted to sink straight into the floor. The judge's voice kept cutting through the air, calm, stern, deliberate, and with every sentence she spoke, I felt the weight inside me loosen, little by little, like something long coiled inside my chest was finally unwinding. When she granted the injunction, it wasn't the victory that hit me, it was the relief, like someone had finally closed a door he kept trying to jam his way through. When she looked at him directly and told him he was fortunate I hadn't chosen to press criminal charges, I saw the moment her words struck him, the exact second he understood he wasn't untouchable, that the world didn't bend just because he expected it to. Outside the courthouse, my sister cornered me, her voice sharp with accusation, telling me I had destroyed him, that I had overreacted, that family should forgive even the worst mistakes. But her words slid off me like rain off stone, because I had already played the conversation in my mind 100 times, and knew nothing I said would ever change her belief that her son was incapable of wrongdoing, even while the evidence sat inches from her face. I walked away while she was still talking, not to be cruel, but because I finally understood she wasn't talking to me. She was talking to a version of me that existed only in her imagination, the one who absorbed every blow without ever pushing back. It was dark by the time I reached the cabin, and the silence hit me in a way it hadn't in weeks. Not frightening, not empty, but grounding, like the land was acknowledging my return after being forced to defend what was already mine. I stepped onto the deck and let the cold night air fill my lungs, the kind of breath that feels like it clears out every last fragment of tension inside you. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the mountain welcome me again, not as a man under siege, but as a man home. Over the next days, the calls slowed, then stopped completely. The emails dried up. The strangers who had been tricked into thinking this was their retreat turned their attention toward him where it belonged. I heard from a neighbor that he was scrambling to deal with the backlash, that the people he had scammed were furious, that some were filing claims, that his own circle of friends, people who once saw him as a visionary, were treating him like a cautionary tale. It wasn't satisfaction that washed over me when I heard that it was clarity, the kind that hits you when you realize someone wasn't destroyed by you. They were undone by their own choices, by their refusal to hear the simplest word, no. One evening, a few days later, I found myself on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the shadow of the ridgeline fade into the night, and I realized something with a quiet certainty. Peace isn't something you find by accident. Peace is something you defend, sometimes harder than you expect, sometimes at the cost of people you thought you'd never have to push away. And as the wind moved through the trees, carrying that familiar soft rustle that had drawn me to this place in the first place, I felt something inside me settle with finality. He had tried to turn my refuge into his profit and failed. I had taken back what was mine, and the mountain felt quiet again. When the final weeks settled in after the hearing, the air around the cabin changed in a way I didn't expect. Not louder, not busier, just clearer, like something thick had finally burned off and the mountain could breathe again, and so could I. I'd wake up each morning expecting some new crisis, expecting another email or another stranger in the driveway, or another desperate call from someone trying to convince me to bend just one more time. And when none of that came, there was this strange emptiness, almost unfamiliar, like peace pressed against my ribs, waiting for me to trust it. I spent hours on the deck in those first quiet days, watching the frost cling to the railing and melt in thin silver lines as the sun climbed the ridge. The silence that used to soothe me now felt deeper, richer, like it had earned its place beside me. Inside the cabin, things felt different too, not physically, but in the way a house shifts when the storm finally passes and the walls exhale. I found myself moving slower, more deliberately, making coffee with both hands, resting on the counter as if grounding myself into the small rituals I had almost lost. There were nights when the shadows stretched long across the floor, and the memory of what had happened crept back in the look on his face. When the judge spoke, the tremor in my sister's voice, the accusations, the blame, the way she tried to twist my refusal into selfishness, it all tried to settle inside me like cold ash. But each time it tried to stick, the mountain reminded me, with the soft rustle of the trees or the low hum of wind against the deck rail, that some choices, even painful ones, are necessary for a life to remain yours. My phone rang less with each passing day. My sister didn't call again, not once. Maybe she was nursing her pride, or maybe she was still telling herself a story where I was the villain and her son was a misunderstood visionary. I didn't try to correct it. Some stories people tell themselves because the truth would shatter too many things they don't want to face. A month after the hearing, her husband called and left a voicemail. His voice tired, older than I remembered, saying he wished things had gone differently, but he understood why I did what I did, and he hoped someday the family could stitch itself together in some small shape again. I listened to it only once, never deleted it, but never returned the call either. Sometimes distance isn't bitterness, sometimes it's survival. The snow came late that winter, a slow, quiet blanket that softened the shape of everything: the driveway, the split rail fence, the old stump at the edge of the yard. I'd sit on the deck, bundled in a heavy jacket, watching the flakes drift down, catching on the pine branches like dust settling over an old book. It was in those moments that the truth settled into me without any resistance, that what I had protected wasn't just lumber and land. It was the first place since losing my wife, where I felt whole again, a place where the noise inside my head finally slowed to something I could live with. I thought often about him, about whether he learned anything from the collapse of his scheme, whether he saw the difference between ambition and entitlement, whether he finally understood that chasing shortcuts always ends with something breaking. And this time the thing that broke had been us. I didn't hate him, not anymore. There was a point when I did, when anger sat sharp inside me like a splinter under skin, but the anger faded, eventually replaced by something colder and sadder, a quiet grief for the version of him that could have been something good if someone had taught him earlier that no isn't an attack and boundaries aren't barriers, they're lifelines. Spring came slow, painting the mountain in greens and soft yellows, and one morning I stepped outside, coffee in hand, and felt something I hadn't felt in months, a sense of beginning. Not dramatic, not loud, just a shift, like the ground beneath me was finally steady again. I walked to the edge of the property where the trees opened to a narrow view of the valley below, and for a moment I stood there, breathing the clean air, letting it push through whatever residue was left in me. I realized then that the cabin wasn't just where I lived, it was where I finally learned to choose myself without apology. There would always be people who believed family meant bending, until you broke, who believed blood granted access to anything you owned or built or loved. But the mountain taught me something different, that love without respect is intrusion, that helping without boundaries becomes sacrifice, that peace must be guarded, the way a firefighter guards breath in a smoke-filled room. That night I sat by the fire, listening to the logs crackle, the heat pulling the cold out of the room, and I felt a quiet pride bloom low in my chest, not for winning anything, but for holding my ground, for protecting the small life I'd built, for myself after decades of giving every last piece of me to a world that never stopped demanding more. And as the flames rose soft and steady, I felt the mountains settle around me like a companion finally unburdened. I had kept what was mine. I had survived the fire someone else tried to start. And in that soft golden light, with the wind humming against the cabin walls, I understood with a certainty that felt like freedom, that this stillness, this solitude, this fragile quiet was worth every battle it took to keep it mine.